we are.
Yes, we are. I think all the panelists are here. Yes.
All right. Maybe I can start by asking everyone to mute their microphones. It's quite noisy, please. If you don't speak, that is. Thank you. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to the session on structural transformation and inclusive development. This session will focus on the relationship between economic inequality and structural transformation in Asia and the Pacific. The objective of the session is to take stock of the latest policy thinking, solicit country-level experiences, and deliberate on gaps and opportunities for policymaking. The session will start with a short briefing by the ESCAP drafting team of the 2022 Economic and Social Survey for Asia and the Pacific. We will then hear from 6 very distinguished speakers, after which there will be time for Q&As. Without further ado, I would like to invite my colleague, Mr. Sheng Yang, who is leading the structural policy chapter of the 2022 survey, to give a brief introduction to the issue of today. Sheng, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Patrick. So let me share my screen. Can everybody see the slides?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you, Patrick, and good afternoon, everyone. As we have learned in the past 2 days of this online expert group meeting, that inequality is increasingly becoming a general public concern and also a priority on the agenda of governments in the Asia-Pacific region. So where a lot of publicity and discussion is around redistribution, the pre-distribution inequality actually plays an equally important role, especially in the context of developing countries, most of which will go through significant and a swift structural transformation, which would shape the inequality dynamics in these countries. So the guiding questions of this particular chapter would be 2. First, that how structural transformation shapes pre-distribution inequality in the experience of Asia and the Pacific, and a little bit also globally. And second, how we can make it more inclusive. So there are 3 sub-objectives of the chapter. The first is to review the latest economic thinking on this front. The second, we would like to analyze the observed pathways in the Asia-Pacific experience and try to identify the underlying drivers of the different like past and dynamics we have observed, and then try to identify the potential policy opportunities for more targeted interventions and more inclusive results. And last, we would like to discuss the related policy considerations. So the traditional thinking framework regarding how structural transformation shapes the inequality dynamics in the developing country context is based on the work of well-known economists like Arthur Lewis, Simon Kuznets, and Nicolas Cardot. The thinking framework is based on 3 factors. First is that it's a dual economy model, which expects significant labor relocation from the low productivity agricultural sector or rural sector to the urban sector characterized by manufacturing and modern services. And then it expects an inverted U-shaped curve as developing countries transform its economy and become industrialized. So the inequality will first go up, then come down. And thirdly, that the manufacturing has a central role in this driving both the structural transformation and also in the inequality dynamics. So there are several modern reflections on this traditional framework and challenges it a little bit as well. So the first is that this stereotype, this Kuznets curve, as we know it, inverted U-shaped stereotype of inequality dynamics during structural transformation is neither a universal nor an automatic process. So several factors were affected, including the initial conditions, whether the countries started with more equality or with already very large inequality gaps. It also depends on the types of the structural transformation, whether it's manufacturing led. It also depends on the economic liberalization and opening up. Of course, institutions and political structure also play a significant role in this. The second reflection is that the the structural transformation process doesn't end at the end of industrialization process. Actually, after a country fully industrialized, it may continue, the structural transformation may continue as the labor relocation become from the traditional manufacturing sectors to the modern services sectors that is even higher productivity and value addition. So this post-industrialization structural transformation may again lead to another rise in inequality levels, as we have seen in the more advanced countries. And again, three factors may have contributed to this, including the technology, which favors capital and skilled labor. Also globalization process, which open competition to the wage earners in the more advanced economies, like having a downward pressure on the employment opportunity and also wage level. So that may also increase the inequality. And then thirdly, the financialization and tertiarization of the economy may also contribute to this phenomenon. So that makes the country left. And thirdly, there's also more futuristic reflections on the relation between structural transformation and inequality, and also on the overall globalization process and how that may affect the inequality level in developing countries. So the argument goes that the future of the fourth industrial revolution, automation, the artificial intelligence. So this new technological revolution may render manufacturing sector jobless, particularly controlled, and will be like the production will be done by robots. But at the same time, the services is becoming more tradable through the better ICT connection across countries, and also the AI facilitation in people-to-people communication, so on and so forth. So that will change the picture of this traditional manufacturing-led structural transformation, and also the prospect, like how developing countries will become linked into the global market and the global division of labor, and how that would shape the inequality dynamics as well. And the second argument is that the disruption in this wave of technological revolution may be much faster than previously, have seen in the previous three industrial revolutions. So that means that the managing this process and address structural inequality caused by the structural disruptions may becoming a bigger problem for countries. Sorry, I think the slides stuck a little bit. Okay, so just very quickly, like we have seen very different trajectories of structural transformation and inequality dynamics in the Asia Pacific region. So here, the brown line indicates the market Gini, which is the Gini coefficient before redistribution, taxes, and transfers. And then the blue line is the manufacturing share of total employment. So as we can see in the top two examples, the Korea and Bangladesh, during their industrialization stage, their inequality level, market inequality level remained relatively stable, indicating that growing with equity is possible. And then in the Korea case, of course, as the economy, after the industrialization phase, and as the economy becomes more service-driven, the inequality level went up again. In the China case, that this is the typical curse of the Kuznets curve, that as China industrialized, the inequality also increased very significantly. In the Philippine case, that there is a structural stagnation, at least in the sense of industrialization, but at the same time, inequality level was also dropping a little bit, driven by different policy combinations. So, what are the main policy considerations that we can derive from this brief review of the evidence we have so far? First is that we can and should guide transformation as different, like we have observed very different structural transformation paths and the inequality dynamics along the way. So the structural transformation can be inclusive, it can be regressive, and it depends heavily on the local context and on the policies. So countries should and need to guide the structural transformation better for it to be more inclusive. And the second, that we observe like different types of disruptions during the structural transformation phase. And because of the cost curve that in at least the relatively larger developing countries of the region, this is a real the increase may be a real challenge. So countries need to do better to manage this transformation process. And thirdly, that countries need to consider the different nature of future structural transformation and its linkages with inequality dynamics and prepare for it. So obviously, I would love and be very excited to listen to and learn from the expert today who would share more detailed knowledge and perspectives on these three fronts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chang, for setting the scene for this session. As Chang highlighted in his presentation just now, we would like to learn three things from our distinguished panelists. Namely, first, how has structural transformation shaped inequality in the past, and how may it shape inequality in the future? The second, what is Asia-Pacific's experience so far? And finally, what is the outlook for Asia-Pacific countries regarding structural transformation? Will inequalities continue to rise? And if so, what can governments actually do to have a more inclusive process? So today we're honored to have with us 6 very knowledgeable and seasoned speakers who will share their insights and perspectives. To facilitate, Mr. Arif, can you please mute your microphone?
Sorry.
Thank you so much. So to facilitate an effective discussion, we would appreciate if you type your questions, if you have any, in the chat box of this meeting session. Please make sure that your question is concise, and kindly also start by indicating to which speaker you're addressing the question. We will take one round of questions after the first 3 presentations, and the second round of questions after the end of after the second speakers. May I also kindly remind each of the panelists to please keep within your interventions within the maximum of 15 minutes. Our first speaker today is Professor Carlos Gradin. Professor Gradin is a research fellow at UNU Wider and a professor of applied economics at the University of Vigo in Spain. His main research interest is in the study of poverty, inequality, and discrimination in both developed and developing countries. He is especially interested in those inequalities that occur between population groups. Professor Gradin has published extensively in specialized journals such as the Journal of Economic Inequality, Review of Income and Wealth, and the Journal of Development Studies. So Professor Gradin, you and the UNU wider team have been following recent trends of economic inequality worldwide. What can you tell us about the general patterns and the dynamics of economic inequality in Asia-Pacific developing countries during, let's say, the past 2 to 3 decades? And have these trends differed across countries? And if so, what do you believe is the main reason for that? Professor Gradin, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you see my screen?
Yes, please, very clear. Okay, no. Yes.
Well, then the presentation I'm gonna do today is about general trends of economic inequality between and within countries. The idea is to give you a brief overview of trends in income inequality in Asia, but in the global context. I will use data on global and country income distributions that comes from the World Income Inequality Database, actually for some companion data sets that we host at UNU Wider, and that is comparable across countries and over time, coming from many different sources based on survey income or consumption. And most of what I'm presenting comes from some research done also at UNU Wider with working papers that are available. The data sets that I'm going to use are also fully open access and transparent with all the documentation, how they were constructed. So one way of looking at the global income distribution is dividing the population, the global population, into three main groups, like the bottom 40%, the top 10%, and then the middle, that 50%. And as you can see in the graph, we can track the share of income, of global income, that goes to each of these groups over time. And it becomes clear that there was a big change after 1980, approximately, in which, after being more or less stable, the income shares of these three groups, and at that time, we observe a large increase in the participation of the top 10% that comes at the expense of the middle 50%. And this changes basically around 2000 when they reverse, and we see a decline in the top 10% and an increase in the middle 50%. The initial change was due to a large extent by the collapse of the socialist regimes in Eastern Europe, but also some processes of income concentration at the top in advanced economies like the United States. But at the same time, we could observe since 1980 approximately a small but continuous increase in the participation of the bottom 40% that doubles until 2019. Still very, very small. It's like about 6% of the total income for 40% of the population, but this is quite significant, and this is obviously strongly related with the Asian, with what happened in Asian countries, because in 1980, both South Asia and East Asia and Pacific accounted for more than 86% of the population in this bottom 40%. This changed substantially over time with the increasing participation of Sub-Saharan Africa and a strong decline in the participation of East Asia, but still today Asia accounts for more than half of the global bottom 40%. A very simple index of inequality that you can draw from here is just the ratio between the top 10, the income of the top 10% and the income of the bottom 40%, which is known as the Palma ratio. And you can see that with the exception of this period of strong concentration at the top, there was a continuous and substantial decline in global inequality due to this process. And we get the same picture if we use other indices of inequality that take into account the whole distribution, so the incomes of the population. They, in general, tend to agree that, especially after the 2000s, there was a strong decline in global inequality. The main driving force of this decline in global inequality was a strong reduction in inequality between countries over this period, and it was partially offset by an increase in inequality within countries, particularly during the 90s. Then it goes, I mean, it's more or less stable or slightly increasing. Even that these within country inequalities, as we will see, is reflecting very heterogeneous patterns, both across regions in the world, but also within some of these regions, that we'll see for the case of Asia. So the main driving force was the decline in inequality between countries, with poorest countries growing faster than richest countries. In fact, we can do some accounting of this change in inequality. For example, here is for the case of the change in the Gini between 2000 and 2019. And I can attribute to each region or country the contribution to this change in inequality, so that the sum of all contributions add up to the total change. So there was a reduction in 8 Gini points during this period. This reduction was the result, as I mentioned, of a larger decline in inequality between countries, of more than 11 Gini points. At the same time, there was an increase in inequality within countries of almost 2 Gini points. And there is also a composition effect, because those effects are measured with constant population. And there is also an important compositional effect due to the faster population growth in poorest areas, basically in Sub-Saharan Africa. And it's easy to check that India and China, but particularly China, account for more than 70% of the decline in inequality between countries. And you can see that part of the rest is also due to other Asian countries, like here you have Indonesia. And basically China and India also account for the total increase in Gini within countries. There are other changes in other regions, but they cancel out. So you can see that China and to a lower extent India is they are responsible or they are driving the main forces in global inequality, both between countries but also within countries. There is obviously, as it's well known, this is due to the very good performance in terms of GDP growth in East Asia and Pacific region, and to a lower extent, more recently in the case of South Asia. But of course, these regions are performing in general better than other developing regions, as particularly compared to the stagnation of incomes in sub-Saharan Africa as a whole, and also the lower growth in Latin America and MENA countries. But there is a lot of heterogeneity within countries in the region. In terms of overall GDP per capita, we know that GDP grew much faster or stronger in Malaysia or in Thailand and China compared, for example, to Bangladesh or Pakistan or India. But this is like the general picture for the GDP per capita. But what about the GDP or the income, the average income that goes to the bottom 40% that I mentioned before? And we can see that the bottom 40% did pretty well in terms of growing absolute level of incomes in PPP dollars over time, and reflecting the differences that we saw before with China, Malaysia, and Thailand seeing their bottom 40% growing faster than the other countries. But however, in terms of inequality, what is relevant is whether these groups are gaining participation in total income or not. And as you can see here, that if we measure the income share of the bottom 40% in each of these countries, there are huge heterogeneity among them. No? We see that China, for most of the time after the economic reforms, but seems to be changing more recently, there was this large decline in the participation of the bottom 40%. But we also see a decline in participation in Bangladesh or in India or in Indonesia. No? On the other hand, Malaysia or Thailand were more successful in increasing not only the average income of this group, but also their participation in total income, while in Pakistan, for example, is more like flat trend. Of course, the other side of the coin is the top 10% of the income of the top 10% of the population, that we can see those countries with declining share of the bottom 40% also show an increasing participation of the top 10%, particularly in the case of China or Bangladesh, but also India. And at the same time, those countries in which the bottom 40% increase their participation show a clear decline in terms of the participation in the top 10%. Whether I mean, this can be translated into global change in inequality, and as you mentioned, or Professor Cheng mentioned before, we observe in the case of China what could be or resemble a Kismet curve, but we probably need to see how this trend evolves over time. But clearly some of the big income gaps, like between rural and urban areas or between the coast and the countryside or the interior of the country inland, are clearly narrowing at this time, but still you can see the asymmetry between the huge increase and the small decline that happened more recently. And also we see the increasing inequality in other countries. So clearly we cannot put all Asian countries in the same basket, even that they are characterized by this reaction to the globalization process by developing our export-oriented economic growth, but the impact in terms of inequality seems to be very different in these countries, and that's something that we need obviously to better understand to make sure that these growth patterns become more inclusive. In general, the region is becoming more equal, but especially East Asia and Pacific, but this is to a large extent due to the reduction in the inequality between countries also in the region. However, the South Asia region tends to be more unequal, basically because of this increasing inequality in countries like Bangladesh or India. No? The region is performing like in middle area between the most equal regions of Europe or North America and the most unequal regions of Sub-Saharan Africa or MENA countries. And just to finish, I would like to mention, okay, what's next? What could we expect that how this picture is going to change basically due to the shock introduced by the pandemic? Well, I would like to distinguish between changes in the short term and changes in the long term. Changes in the short term, we can see that I wouldn't expect big changes in terms of inequality between countries, even that we can be tempted to say, okay, this is increasing inequality between countries. I think just translating the numbers from the last or the most recent IMF GDP projections, there could be even a small decline in global inequality in 2020 between countries, because there are like forces going in opposite directions. No? On the one hand, we have the largest contraction of GDP that we observe in India and also to some extent in Latin American countries, but also there are large contractions of GDP in advanced economies, while the contraction in low-income countries tends to be smaller. There is also some expansion in China, but the phenomenon that, I mean, the contribution of China is going to change in the future because it contributed to reduce inequality between countries in the world, but now China is basically very close to the global mean, what means that its contribution to this declining trend is going to be more modest, and at some moment it's going to be even going in the opposite direction. More growth in China will imply more global inequality. In terms of within country inequalities, I think we also observe like different forces, even that probably here is more likely to expect an increase in inequality compared to previous years, because there is a disequalizing effect among the poor in many countries because of the asymmetric impact of the lockdown on the most vulnerable workers, like informal workers or those working in face-to-face services. We are aware of the unequal access to telework by different types of workers or the access to digitalization. This has been strongly mitigated by massive income transfer, but obviously this happened mainly in richer countries. And also we know that there is a smaller impact of the pandemic in some rural areas. So these effects will partially at least cancel out. I think we should be probably more concerned with the impact in the long term, both within countries because of this terrible impact that the pandemic is taking in the health of the most vulnerable part of the population, but also in the human capital because of the disruptions in the learning process. It's probably going to accentuate the digital divide among those who have access to new technologies and those who don't. And also might change what remember is the main driving force reducing inequality in the world, that is the reduction in inequality between countries. It's possible that there are some changes, we will see some changes in international trade because there will be probably an increase in protectionism or an effort to reindustrialize some rich economies that could affect the possibilities of low-income countries to catch up with the rest. So thank you very much. Looking forward for the discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor Grud. It's a very interesting presentation. Sorry, I get a lot of echo here. All right, it was a very interesting presentation, which gives us a lot of food for thought, and I think you present a very mixed picture. Thank you also very much for sticking to the time allocated. Let me now turn to our second speaker, Professor Arif Anshouri Yusuf. Mr. Yusuf is a professor of economics at Pajajaran University in Indonesia and founding director of the university's Center for Sustainable Development Goals Studies. His research focuses mainly on economic development, particularly on poverty and inequality, but also on the interlinkages between the economy and the environment. Professor Yusuf is particularly well known for his expertise in economic modeling using computable general equilibrium models. So Mr. Yusuf, you recently co-authored, including with the ESCAP Executive Secretary, a paper called The Developer's Dilemma, a survey of structural transformation and inequality dynamics, Could you please give us a brief introduction of the rationales behind this paper and its conclusion? And what can we say about this dilemma in the case of your own country, Indonesia, drawing on your rich research in this area? Professor Yusuf, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. Answering to that question, but let me check first that my voice is okay. Okay.
It's all good. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So basically, the research that you mentioned previously is actually asking these three questions. First is what kind of structural transformation that have been experienced in many developing countries. We have 9 countries as a samples, and then what actually the inequality dynamics that accompany each of this type of ST, and then which policy that have enacted to manage the tension between ST and income inequality. And then later on, I will add more about Indonesia. So the answer to that question can be read in these 2 publications. So the first is the forthcoming book written by 4 co-authors, including ESCAP Secretary, Professor Armida, and then Kunal Sen, UNU Wider Director, Professor Andi Samer from King's College, and myself. And then for Indonesian case, I'm going to base my talk from this recent paper we published with Andy and one other guy. So the first question, so basically from these 9 countries studies across time for long period of observations, we find actually, unlike most traditional views of the Kuznets type of inequality later on, but in terms of the structural transformation itself, we find that there are multiple pathways of economic development. And from this observation, we come up with these typologies that we have what we call primary industrialization, for example, where it's the country's manufacturing value-added shares decline, yet the manufacturing employment shares, such as in India. And then we also found in certain period the upgrading industrialization in China. We have the industrialization in Brazil, and then advanced industrialization in South Korea, and then more recently stall industrialization in Thailand, also in some other countries. So this is the typology that we come up with. Yeah? And then then you can see here, for example, in terms of Indonesia, and that Indonesia actually can be in 2 categories of variety of ST. For example, during the period of early development in 1975 to 1985, as well as in 1985 and 1996, we experienced upgrading industrialization, where in terms of policy or policy-wise, in the early period, we have import substitutions. And then we also have, later on, we have export-oriented FDI and focusing on labor-intensive. Yet, in more recent time, after we have a political reform, for example, from 1999 to 2012, we are experiencing stall industrialization. So it's not yet the industrialization, but stall industrialization. And we think that this can be explained by several factors, such as capital utilization in the early recovery from the Asian financial crisis. And then also again from the Asian financial crisis, we have macroeconomic adjustment, and then such as from exchange rate, a big depreciation. Then we think that China accession to the WTO also matters. And then of course, automation may play a role too. Then in terms of the relationship between how this structural transformation, growth enhancing structural transformation and inequality, we also come up with some sort of typology where we can have, for example, Kuznetian tensions that can be strong, where you have growth enhancing ST accompanied by increasing inequality, but you may as well weak one or benign ones. For example, that Indonesia in 1975 and 1996, we experienced what we call benign Kuznetian tension. We have a strong structural transformation, yet we managed to have stable or a little declining in terms of equality, and then we attribute this to Indonesian government rural development, education provision, and also proper spending. But yet we also experience later on weak or adverse Kuznetian tension, where we find inequality increasing, yet we don't have growth enhancing structural transformations. And then, so this kind of puzzle at the beginning, but we may attribute this to tertiarization, for example, and automation. So the main takeaway from this cross-country survey is three, I think. First, we find multiple variations of ST beyond the traditional pathway. And we also, I think we want to emphasize that rising inequality during economic development is actually not inevitable. So we can avoid that. Then we saw that, we observed that. And we found in terms of policy that if we follow broad-based or inclusive economic development, which actually it requires public policy to address any upswing in inequality and to spread the benefit of the economic development to as many people as possible, and particularly to those people and those areas that left behind. So now let's turn to the second part of the presentation, which is Indonesia. So what happened in Indonesia across the last several decades? Yeah? So what we find is, if we do simple calculations of the composition of labor productivity along this several different time period, we found that the earlier part of Indonesian development, actually the structural change is strong. So the share, for example, of structural change in growth in labor productivity is 0.6 or 60%. However, over time it declines. So, and then you can see that the declining is faster the more recent time. So, for example, in the last period, we find that the structural change only contribute 15% to Indonesian growth in labor productivity. So we experience declining of structural transformation in Indonesia. And in terms of inequality, we found that in that particular period where we have this weak structural transformation, actually we find that inequality increased in all sectors of the economy, including agriculture. Not to mention, for example, finance or on market services, where of course traditionally there always been unequal in terms of the sectors, but you can see that inequality increase occur in all sectors of the economy, and we found, for example, that if you can see here, if we want to decompose this inequality changes into within sector and between sector, so that's the traditional notions of Kuznetian's dynamic, right? So we found actually that within sector inequality is the one that dominates the increase. Between sector inequality barely change. So in agriculture, in manufacturing, in other service, you can see that the color change, and the changing color is quite noticeable. But the between one, I think there's not much changing color. So it means that yes, that the inequality change mostly dominated, largely dominated by within sector inequality. So that's what we see from Indonesian case. And you can see here, for example, our data of 500 districts over 25 years. So the strong correlations between structural change and inequality of almost all sectors in the economy. Particularly the tension of Kuznetian, notion is higher during the period of 2000 to 2017. Here, so 2000 to 2017, in almost all sectors of the economy. And we did some regression analysis in the paper just to show that actually the quadratic relationship is identified in Indonesia. So the Kuznets curves seems likely, but calculating the turning point, it's almost, you know, it's the turning point of that quadratic relationship is almost, you know, like is not meaningful, not meaningful because it's too far. So we find, for example, most of the turning point are considerably above the current district means, and only a few districts have labor shares above the turning point. Why I emphasize this? I emphasize this because in the near future, we show this trend where the trade services, for example, the structural change happen not between manufacturing, with agriculture share keep declining, the manufacturing actually the labor employment share stagnant. But the one that increased is the trade services. So this trade services is the low productivity sector of the service sector. So if you see labor share of the trade service increasing, yet its value added share declining or slightly stable, so you expect that the productivity of this sector fall. And this trend seems to be strong. So combined with this finding, this is quite challenging for Indonesia in the future because we want to have inclusive economic development, yet this structural change seems to be a challenge, I think, in the near future. So what we come up with the policy implication for this, what we can do with it. So we have two options. This is including the one talked about within the ministries, within the government circle. Yeah? So we have two options. We can have tertiarization, yes, allow the tertiarization happen, but complement with skill upgrading policy, adjust with future of works adjustment, future of works trend, and also combine in social protection. Yet there are also some parties in the government or in the academic world that prefer reindustrialization, where we can have active industrial policy, where manufacturing can continue to play a role. Yet then we improve the reindustrialization by, for example, taking into account the changing technology, digital technology to have the more high value added economic growth. So that's basically, I think, my take for these sessions. I also want to apologize because I cannot be here until the session finish because I have to chair some other session in other conference. Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Yusuf, for sharing these findings and for your reflections on Indonesia in this respect. And we're sorry to hear that you will not be with us to the end of the Q&A, I understand, right? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So let me now turn to our third speaker, Professor Guanghua Wang. Professor Wang is director of the Institute. Professor Yusuf, could you please turn up your microphone?
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you. So Professor Wang is director of the Institute of the World Economy at Fudan University in China. Prior to becoming the director, he was a principal economist at the Asian Development Bank, project director at Uni Wider, excuse me, and taught in a number of universities in Australia and China. Trained in development economics and econometrics, he has an outstanding publication record of more than 100 professional articles and a dozen books. Professor Wang, China's economic success and structural transformation in the past 3 decades was accompanied by a significant surge in inequality. Now the government is shifting its policy away from GDP growth towards a more shared prosperity and narrowing inequality gaps. In the context of global economic difficulties and trade tensions, how are these new developments affecting inclusive development and inequality in China? And what structural policies would be needed to achieve the goals of a more inclusive society? Professor Wang, you have the floor, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much for bringing me to this interesting conference. I'm going to spend about maybe 12 to 13 minutes telling you a story about what's happening in China, which of course will be closely related to the issue of income distribution. But let me start. Let me start with this chart, which some of us might be familiar. At least you know the sort of growth success of China. This is a growth trend of China, and of course, China started reform in the late 1970s, and so you can focus on from 1980 onwards. You can see this rising trend in growth, quite high growth, but you will notice the slowdown in China since 2008 and 2009. And the slowdown is still happening. Initially, of course, we know it was due to the global financial crisis, but many economies recovered to some extent afterwards, but the Chinese economy did not. And that has been happening, the slowdown has really happening for the last 12, 13 years. I mean, of course, the pandemic is a sort of shock, but even before the pandemic, the growth rate has been dropping from more than 12% to about 6.3% in 2019, just before the crisis. So, I mean, we're going to ask, what happened? If obviously the global financial crisis is not the answer. I mean, it of course caused the slump in the growth rate for a couple of years, but it never recovered at all, and it continues to slide. And to answer that question, really, we got to come back to the question, what really drives China's growth? And I mean, we can do a lot of research and come up with many different answers, but to many, to me and to majority of Chinese non-economists, they will tell you it's due to reforms and opening up. So China has been, I mean, in my own words, China has been running on two legs since the late 1970s. One leg is internal reforms, mainly targeting the supply problem, and then the opening up, which is external, and that of course gives us technology, but also solve the marketing issue. I mean, we all know China exporting a lot of commodities outside. So we'll be running on these two legs, but one of the legs, and so one of the two legs is really, we can summarize that using word globalization. And we can see, actually, use data to demonstrate the importance, how important globalization is to the Chinese economy. Here's the chart. The columns represents the size of China's GDP, and the curve represents the percentage of Chinese GDP to the US. So if you look at this chart, because I mean, the chart is familiar to us. I mean, China has been catching up, China has been growing, but there are two things we can pick up, or two historical, very important events which will be written in history, which relate to globalization and relate to China's growth. One is this picture. For those know China, they can instantly tell. This picture is showing Deng Xiaoping, who is the architect of China's reform, and he was touring the southern part of China in early 1992. So for many economists working in China, when they do modeling, they will put 1992, they will use a dummy variable to separate China before and after 1992, because his southern tour made huge difference, pushing forward again the reform and opening up process of China. And did that produce any impact? Well, you can see that if you look at this the curve, you can see a clear upturn in China's growth in terms of course, catching up with the United States. China has been really speeding up that catching up process. So, and that's closely related to globalization and opening up. The second is happening after about 2000, around 2001, 2002, and we all know that's another historical event which happening in China, and that is the WTO. And of course, WTO is represents globalization for China, so to join in the global production and network. So these two events obviously were very important in driving China's economic growth. But we can also do two comparisons to try to highlight the importance of globalization for growth in China. One is of the obvious one. If you compare to a counterfactual or do a comparison before and after reform in China. Before the reform, growth was pretty slow and fluctuating a lot. After reform, I mean, we've been growing very fast, and of course, one of the key issues, as we mentioned, is the opening up, the globalization. And we actually can look back over China's history to see the importance of globalization for China. And that's the chart demonstrating that point. Here is two estimates of Chinese economy since about 1000 AC. And you can see China has been quite important, occupying around 25% of the global economy until about year 1600. You can see both curves. I mean, they declined slightly. One declined slightly, one declined quite a lot, and of course, sharp decline after 1820. Now, if you ask any educated Chinese, what happened, for China's demise in the last about 300 years, or if you go back, say 400 years, they will tell you it's simply due to the China was closed the door to the outside. So with that, then we come back to that issue, why growth has been slowing down in China after 2008. Well, simply because the globalization move has been happening since about 2008. It's receiving more and more attention, but that actually has happened quite a while ago. Now here's a chart showing the non-tariff barriers before and after 2008, 2009. You can see after 2008, after the financial crisis, you have a fairly high level of protection, and we can also see the trade volume, global trade volume before and after 2009. And before the financial crisis, trade growth has been faster than economic growth, or had been. But after that, trade growth is much lower than global economic growth. So that's on trade. FDI gives the same story. So what I'm trying to say is really the growth slowdown in China has a lot to do with the globalization. And that's not really part of the economic cycle, which many Chinese economists and some foreign friends were saying. It was due to the economic cycle. China has been growing so fast and for so long, and you have a cycle. It's come to that stage. But this chart actually tells you that's not the case, as I mentioned earlier. Here is the growth rate of major economies in the world around the financial crisis. What you could see is, most of us recovered to a large extent recovered. I mean, forget about the pandemic. But there was only one exception. That's the top, which is China, and it has been slowing down, and it's still continuing to slow down. So in short, the slowdown in China is not part of the economic cycle. It's not part of the internal problem the economists in China or the government even has been saying. What I'm saying is really due to the globalization move. And I actually has been providing that warning to China, says that the globalization has been happening, and the geopolitics has been will change the fundamentals of China's growth. And well, you will not be able to read this, but that this is the very first seminar I did when I returned to China. And the title of this seminar was Growth Prospect of China. Subtitle is Inequality and the Globalization. So that was in 2018. So obviously, with this deglobalization move, China must raise domestic demand. And I personally have been calling for raising domestic demand for many, many years. And you know, at least 3 years ago. But the government, for those who know the Chinese government, who know what's happening in China, the government has been implementing what they call supply side reform since about 2013. And they insist nothing to do with demand until last May. So last May, in the end, the government launched this called dual circulation strategy. Now, I want to emphasize that this is a significant, very important change of China's growth strategy. In late 1970s, China started this opening up and join the global network, and a lot of imports, exports, and FDIs, and so on. Although the government, when they launched the dual circulation strategy, they say we still want to rely, to utilize, take advantage of the global market, but we're going to emphasize a lot on on internal factors. And in defining this dual circulation, you can use 3 words in English. It's innovation and domestic demand. Now, to me, innovation is not new. I mean, every company, every country, every region, want to be innovative, and China has been emphasizing this also for many years. What's really new, or what's really represent the significant or fundamental change, is the change, calling for raising domestic demand. Now, domestic demand, of course, to us, we know there are 2 components of domestic demand. One is domestic investment, and one is consumption. And I'm telling you, there are quite limited potential for China to increase investment, because many of us know the Chinese model, which is not sustainable, and now it's actually, we have seen that consequence of this model, which is called high growth, high export, and high investment. And with that comes with sort of declining in the returns to investment. So that's the estimate of the World Bank and of returns to investment in China. Now, it used to be very high, and we can understand that time China was short of capital, then declined, and more recently it declined to below 15%. And the latest puts the return to investment to about 5-6%. So with this low return and with the constantly high investment rate, there is limited potential for China to increase investment. So it really, this change in the development strategy of China really boils down to reduce savings or increasing consumption rate. Now, but that's not good. Not going to be easy. This is a chart showing the savings rate, which of course the opposite of consumption rate of the world, Japan, Korea. And if you look at this chart, China's savings rate is 20% higher than the global average, which means the consumption rate will be 20% lower. I mean, it's quite dramatic. Then, of course, East Asia saves more than others, but China's savings rate is 10% higher than East Asia. So you would ask, why East Asians, and particularly Chinese, saving so much and consume relatively so little? Well, the first thing is culture. And if you check the global foreign currency reserve, I mean, East Asia holds about 6% of global reserve, and China, of course, occupying a very high percentage of that share. And another reason of this high savings and relatively less consumption is the very high inequality in China. So here's a chart showing the inequality trend in China since the economic reform. The top one is the Gini coefficient, the bottom is the TAI index, and both of that, showing rising inequality in China. Although there has been a declining since about 2008, 2009 inequality, but inequality remains quite high in China. Now, with that high inequality, that of course affects consumption, and that's why the government this May, a few months ago, launched another campaign called Common Prosperity. I mean, what really common prosperity? Of course, we know it's really means we've got to try to reduce inequality in China. By reducing inequality, you can boost domestic consumption, which of course means higher domestic demand. Hopefully, it will offset some of the impacts of the globalization, and that will help the Chinese economy to recover or to maintain, stop declining further. Now, the earlier, this one is the income inequality. What about wealth inequality? Now, income inequality at the moment stands about 0.42, which is quite high if you compare with earlier reform period, and still high by any standard. But the more worrying issue, and it's more serious than income inequality, is the wealth inequality in China. This actually two charts showing the inequality in total wealth. What you could see is in the mid-1990s, the wealth Gini was only 0.4, so similar to income, it's quite low. But by 2018, it's risen to 0.7, which is on a par with more or less many countries in Europe. And now you might say, hey, this is not higher than the other countries. But the point I wanted to make, I want to emphasize, is this dramatic rise in wealth inequality happened only within about 20 years. And it took other countries, many years, even over 100 years to have, to reach this wealth inequality, wealth Gini of 0.7, 0.75, but it only took China about 20 years. And the housing wealth inequality is even worse. What you could see is in 2002, we don't have older data. In 2002, was housing wealth Gini was 0.6, and it's now risen to almost 0.8, and that only happened within about 15 years. So I want to really reiterate the speed of rise in income inequality, in wealth and housing inequality, which really matters, which really hurts the consumption in China. Now, in the past, that was fine. China exports a lot out of the country. So even with sluggish domestic demand, China can manage to grow. But after 2008, things changed. And of course, we all know what's happening right now in terms of geopolitics. The Sino-US trade war, even now it's beyond trade, it's beyond economics, it's beyond science and technology. It's going, looks like, towards a full confrontation. So let me skip this other indicator talking about this inequality. So that's why the Chinese government launched this common prosperity campaign. It's really targeting the inequalities in income, wealth, and other dimensions. And without doing that, without solving this inequality problem, the Chinese economy will probably continue to slide. So if you ask me in the end, what's the growth outlook, which is important not only just to us, to Chinese, but also to many firms in Asia and beyond, everywhere. If you want to really try to address this question, the growth outlook, you really want to ask, you got to ask whether the dual circulation strategy will work. And the dual circulation strategy, as I mentioned, it really means whether China can successfully raise the consumption, internal consumption. And as I mentioned, the internal consumption, whether China can succeed in raise domestic consumption, we've got to ask the question whether the common prosperity campaign can succeed or not. Now, I don't have that answer, and I don't want to speculate, but I can tell you it's going to be very challenging. It's because this high savings relates to the Eastern Asian culture, and the culture is a very, very slow variable, and also inequality. And we know inequality is very difficult to change as well. So in the end, I want to leave a question for all of us to think about. Now China's growth rate in the last 2 years averaged about 5%. And 5% is very important for China from many different perspectives, which I don't have time and which is not appropriate for me to discuss. But we got to ask, given all this background, whether China can maintain 5% or above growth rate in the next 5-10 years. So that's the end for my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Wang, for these insights on the future of China's economy and inclusive development efforts. Can everyone please okay, thank you. So we will now take a first round of questions from the floor. We have roughly 10 minutes for this, so I would kindly ask our presenters to be as concise as they can in their responses. I see from do we still have Professor Yusuf with us? Or did you leave, Professor Yusuf? Oh, he left. Okay, so we had a question for you, but then we move on to Professor Gradin. So there's a question from, apologies for my pronunciation here, Nid Panish. So Professor Gradin, you introduced the global inequality trends in the past 7 decades. To what extent did the trends of pre-distribution inequality deviate from the trends of inequality in disposable income? Professor, can you answer that question, please? It's not an easy one, but you're the professor.
No, I mean, it's a very interesting question when we talk about inequality. No, definitely they would be different, but usually with pre-distribution inequalities larger, especially will be higher in developed countries where the contribution of redistribution to reduce the level of inequalities is much higher. I think it's quite modest in the developing world, even that there was significant progress over time in some areas with, for example, the development of these conditional cash transfers or pension systems, etc. But I would say that probably the main trends that I mentioned here will be the same whether you use net income or you use market income of any kind. So I wouldn't expect a big change. Probably with more variability, probably with more increases in inequality within countries that sometimes are buffered by redistribution, but not the big trends. I think it doesn't change the big picture. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the next question is for Professor Wang from Bishwa Natiwari. So he thanks you for the excellent presentation. You said that China is different from other countries. Its growth did not deep down because it changed the development strategy and encouraged domestic consumption. But other countries have also higher consumption. This is evident because China has higher savings compared to other countries. Despite this fact, how is China able to maintain its economic growth at a higher level, and what can it do to sustain it given the demographic changes and rapid population aging? Mr. Wang, would you be available to answer the question, please?
Sure. No, I mean, what I was saying is that in the past, I mean, you got to really separate 2008, 2009 are the dividing years. Before then, China's savings also quite high. Consumption was low, but China utilized the international market to balance supply and demand. But after 2008, 2009, and things are getting worse and worse with the globalization move, China can no longer rely on external market for balancing domestic supply and domestic demand. And that's why we've been experiencing slowing down, and quite dramatic slowing down, from about more than 12% now to 6%, and we're heading 5%. And that's why I ended with the question, say, we all think about whether China can maintain a 5% in the next many years. Forget about the pandemic. So what I'm saying is consumption is the key, or raising domestic consumption is the key, which is closely related to inequality. And inequality is something not easy to handle, we all know. So we got to watching to see what's going to happen in China on the common prosperity campaign.
Thank you, Professor Wang. I see we have no more questions. Can I maybe take the opportunity to ask you one question as well?
Sure.
Because you said that the return to investment is falling, and that consumption and has to increase and savings has to reduce. I was just curious about the savings in China. What are the Chinese saving for? Is it real estate or own housing, or what do they save for? Because it's so much higher than in other countries. Thank you. Professor Wang, do you want to respond, or?
Can you hear now? I'm
yes,
saying
we can hear now.
No, I mean, the savings is not in terms of real estate investment. I mean, if you buy and if you invest, it's become part of the investment, part of the domestic demand. The main part, I can tell you, 3 trillion of foreign currency, the greenback. I mean, it's part of the savings, of course, not in terms of Chinese currency. It's 100 trillion Chinese savings internally in terms of cash. I mean, or not cash, but in the bank, the household saving, and about 7 trillion US investment overseas of Chinese companies. So you really talk about savings, which partly offset by you investing in other countries. Part of real estate, about 1 trillion is the US the bond, right? And there are other 2 trillions in terms of other kind of investment in the United States and Europe.
Thank you. So we have a final question here from Wise Parai. So the question is for Professor Gradin. With the rapid technological changes on the way, climate changes, etc., going forward, are we going to see a service-led growth in the future? That is, manufacturing will not necessarily provide the platform for structural transformation. Mr. Gradin, please.
Yeah, thank you. No, I totally agree that, I mean, the economic growth, the pattern of economic growth is going to change, particularly in Asia, where we are going to see a tremendous increase in services. And what we know is that the growth that is based on services can be more unequal than growth based on manufacturing, no? And that will have consequence probably in terms of inequality, because some services are low skill and with low pay, and some services are very well paid. This is going to change partially also due to automation and technological change, because we know that also high skill services can be threatened by these changes in technology and outsourcing to other countries, etc. So, I mean, it's hard to say what's going to happen, but totally agree that services will determine the terms both in growth and inequality in the future, and will be dramatically affected by the level of technological change and the penetration of these technologies in developing countries.
Thank you very much. This closes the first round of questions. So I would like to thank our prominent speakers very much for their great presentations and for your clear responses to the questions. I understood that Professor Yusuf had to leave, and I think Professor Wang also have other commitments to attend to. So I would like to thank you both for your excellent presentation, again, and valuable knowledge you have shared with us here today. I know that my colleagues will also be in touch with you for the finalization of the survey chapter later on. Let me now turn to our fourth speaker today, Professor Sound Rai. Ms. Rai is a professor at the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations in New Delhi. Professor Rai is specializing in industry and international trade issues. Her areas of interest include global value change, technological upgrading of Indian industries, free trade agreements and trade creation effects, FDI, efficiency and productivity of firms, and climate-related issues. She has published widely on these issues in both books and journals. Professor Rai, inequality in India used to be quite stable, but since 1990, the Gini coefficient has climbed significantly from around 40 to 50. This coincided with the period of economic liberalization and fast growth. And the structural transformation was mainly from agriculture to services, while the manufacturing remained relatively stable. Was structural transformation, or the lack of it, a main factor behind the increase in inequality in India? And do you believe that India can push forward with national structural transformations like Made in India, while also stopping or reversing the trends of rising inequality? Professor Rai, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Is my screen visible?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. I will answer these questions in terms of what we have found from India. This is actually joint work based on a paper published by UNU Wider in 2020 with Sabyasachi Kar of Institute of Economic Growth. So there are 4 possible pathways that I will talk about in terms of structural transformation and inequality in India. So the motivation of my talk is basically to answer the 2 questions that were put to me. Is structural transformation or the lack of it the main factor behind the inequality dynamics in India? And we will try to answer in terms of the 2 episodes of growth and structural transformation that we see in the Indian context. Secondly, what can India do to push forward with national structural transformation? And here I will talk about 4 possible pathways that we can see going forward, and how a structural transformation and inequality play out in each of those pathways. So turning to the basic issue about what is structural transformation, a lot has been said about it. Basically, it focuses on from the work of Kuznets, that labor abundant developing countries and the sectoral transfer of labor from rural to urban areas as the country develops. And this is the primary driver of economic development. Now, the shift in employment could occur in tandem with rising income inequality in the early stages of development, which is the upswing stage, and they then later fall in with the downswing, which gives you the inverted U or the Kuznets curve. The Kuznets process of widening inequality with structural transformation has 2 sub-processes in it. One is the between sector inequality, which basically means includes the movement of people from a sector characterized by lower mean income to a sector with higher mean income. And then there is the within sector inequality, which is the movement of people from a sector with low within sector inequality to a sector with higher within sector inequality. Now, if both of these processes work in the same direction, then structural transformation will unambiguously increase inequality. And Macmillan and Roderick in their paper basically contend that this is the central insight of development, that it entails structural change. And Roderick, by combining the insights of the Solow model, focusing on growth process of the modern sector, while the dual economy relations economy models of Lewis and then Fay and Rannis focus on the relationship between the sectors. So structural transformation basically then involves the movement of workers from low productivity to high productivity activities and sectors, and it is defined as the reallocation of economic activity across the 3 broad sectors, that is agriculture, industry, and services. Now, how has this played out in the context of India? This graph basically shows you the sectoral share of the employment composition of India from 1960 to 2012. And as you can see, the sectoral share of agriculture, which is the orange part of it, it fell from about 71.8% in 1960 to 54.6% in 2010. But this employment share has fallen less than the share of value added from agriculture, which is about from 52.7% in 1960 to 15.3% in 2010. The share of manufacturing in this period has increased from about 9.6% in 1960 to 11.5% in 2010, and there has been significant increase in a share of employment in the utilities and construction sector and in the non-business service sector, which has increased from about 16.1 in 1960 to 23.6 in 2010. So from India's point of view, the structural transformation that has been witnessed has been more successful in terms of value added than the employment share, and industrialization has been limited in terms of increasing employment, particularly in the manufacturing sector, because neither value added nor the employment share has increased very significantly in the 50-year period. And this is what has been characterized as a secular deindustrialization. In the utilities and construction sector, there has been increase in the share of the value added, but it has been limited, and the increase of employment has been more significant, and this can be called primary industrialization. So the growth, Indian growth story has actually been of tertiarization in terms of value added and employment. And all of these results have been confirmed by a host of authors, including Rodrick et al. 2016, Kochar et al. 2006, Kotwal et al. And Diao et al. Etc. Turning to the inequality story. Now, this graph basically shows the gross and the net income Gini from 1960 to 2012. As you can clearly see from the graph that there is a dip to about 1975, whereafter it increases. But of course, it is also important to see that there is you have to look at the distribution of income and consumption for the whole population and the dynamics over the time. So turning to the first question, was structural transformation or lack of or lack thereof were the main factor for the inequality dynamics? For this, I want to show you two graphs. First is the left-hand panel is shows you the gross income Gini and manufacturing value-added share, while the right-hand panel shows you the gross income Gini and the non-business value-added share. These are the two major non-agricultural sectors. Now, as the left panel basically shows that the value-added share of manufacturing, the inequality was actually stable despite the significant increase in the sectoral share roughly before 1980. And in terms of, but it did rise, say, after 1980. So the developer's dilemma, as has been called, is absent in the period 1960 to 1980, but it manifests itself after 1980. So the graph actually highlights the trade-off that I spoke about, but it is not so apparent when we are focusing on the value-added share of the different sectors of the economy. So I will actually turn to the employment, which shows the dilemma in clearer terms. So now you can see that again on the left panel you have the gross income Gini and the manufacturing employment share, while on the right panel you have the gross income Gini and the non-business employment share. And here you can see that while in the period 1960 to 1980, the inequality is stabilized, but there is negligible structural transformation. But in the post-1980 period, there is significant structural transformation together with the rise in inequality. And so the Indian economy actually can, in this period, can be characterized in terms of two distinct episodes of from 1960 to 1980, where inequality is stabilized and there is negligible structural transformation, and very little increase or decrease in employment share in any of the 5 non-agricultural sectors. The second episode is one of 1980 to 2010, where there is significant structural transformation, but there is a large increase in inequality. And if we turn basically to the decomposition of labor growth, productivity in terms of growth, we see that again this becomes very apparent. So the bar on the top is for the entire period, which is 1960 to 2010, But the bars at the bottom shows you the two distinct periods, 1960 to 1980, and then 1980 to 2010. And you can see that while in the first case, that is largely within growth, in terms of the second part, the second episode, it is also not only within, it is also between. So turning to basically the tension, the Kuznets tension, this can be actually characterized in terms of whether or not what is happening to inequality and structural transformation. So the structural transformation could be weak or strong, and inequality could be increasing or stable or declining. And our two periods are actually characterized in terms of the first period or the first episode, where the Kuznets tension is ambiguous, and the structural transformation was not that significant. And the second period or episode from 1980 to 2010, where the Kuznets tension is strong, that significant structural transformation, but inequality is also rising. So then to answer the question that was structural transformation or the main factor behind the inequality dynamics, we have to make a distinction not only between the sectors, but also what has happened within the sectors. And so the answer is not an ambiguous yes or no. It depends. It depends on what kind of structural transformation happens. In the Indian context, the structural transformation has really been led by the services sector, and which is why you have had inequality also rising, which has been confirmed by other studies as well. So turning to the next question, that what can India do to push forward with national structural transformation? This graphs basically show you the changes in labor productivity and employment share for the two periods, the left panel for 1960 to 1980 and the right panel for 1980 to 2010. And what it shows you actually is that there is a trade-off between the productivity and employment share for each of the non-major and manufacturing sectors. Now, and the sectors which have seen more than the average increase in labor productivity are shown in bold. And you can see right away that in the right panel, there has been significant structural transformation in all the sectors except mining. But this is not the case in the earlier episode of 1960 to 1980. So in terms of the choices and trajectories that India witnesses, or could witness, we again posit that there could be four trajectories. In the first one, if we assume that in the future, the world trade environment is characterized by low global growth and protectionist policies towards developing countries. And we also assume that the political competition remains intense in India. If this kind of a combination holds, then much as in the first period episode that we showed, the economic policy paradigm will turn anti-globalization, protectionist, and there you would have very little structural transformation and growth and inequality, but inequality would also remain under control. In trajectory 2, we assume that in the future, the world trade becomes more favorable to developing countries, and the political competition also remains intense, which means that there would be no consensus on supply side reforms. This would mean that you would have high level of structural transformation, but rise in inequality. And the inequality would have to be managed by the state, much like the MGNEREGA programs that India has seen from 2006. In trajectory 3, we assume that in the future, the world trade is more favorable to developing countries, and the political competition also does not derail the supply side consensus. So this is really the best outcome for India in terms of structural transformation and reducing inequality. And the four trajectories actually can be seen in terms of this chart here. Now, basically, then structural transformation and inclusiveness depend on the two factors that I've mentioned. What is the global economic international economic outlook or globalization, and what is the nature of the domestic political competition? The combination of these two would determine whether India follows trajectory 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. The best case scenario is, of course, trajectory 3, because where you have structural transformation in manufacturing and inequality is controlled. But trajectory 4 is also a possibility, because in this case, what happens, I mean, since 2014, the political competition in India is less. And so it is, factor market reforms are possible, but on the globalization front, there are contradictory signals, largely because of the protectionist language that we see from US and the other major developed countries. So it is possible that we could actually move towards trajectory 4, which is the worst case scenario, because not only that there is no structural transformation, there is inequality also goes up. But given that there has been some large-scale fiscal stimulus, there could be demand leakage in recent times. And so it could actually push towards trajectory 3, which is the best case scenario. So to answer the question, what would the structural transformation and inequality pathway look like? It could be a combination of, it could be any of those. We would be hoping for a trajectory 3, but we might actually end up in trajectory 4. Thank you. I will stop here.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Professor Rai. Very informative. We will definitely follow closely the developments of India. Let me now turn to our 5th speaker today, who is Professor Andy Sumner. Mr. Sumner is Professor of International Development and Director of the Economic and Social Research Council at King's College in London. He has 20 years international research experience using both qualitative and quantitative methods, and has published extensively, including 10 books and 50 journal articles and many book chapters. His most recent books are Global Poverty and Development and Distribution. Unfortunately, Professor Sumner could not join us in person today, but he has kindly agreed to pre-record his presentation. So we asked Professor Sumner about the latest global evidence on the interactions between industrialization, tertiarization, and distribution, and what policy lessons we can derive from it. Can I please ask the team to show the presentation on the screen?
Hello, I'm Andy Sumner. Thank you for inviting me to this UN ESCAP expert meeting on very important issues as we face the aftermath or the ongoing pandemic. So what I'm going to talk about is structural change, structural transformation, and income inequality, in particular focusing on industrialization and tertiarization. So it reflects 2 books I've recently written and one more forthcoming next year. The first, I'd like to ask 4 questions, basically. The first is there a common pattern of structural transformation for countries? I think we often think of the inverted U for manufacturing shares over time, but actually what we think in some of the work I've been doing with colleagues, some of whom are on the panel this morning, are there's several different types of structural transformation. We can think of manufacturing, employment, and value-added shares and the direction of those shares. And then we produce these 5 varieties of structural transformation: primary industrialization, upgrading, advanced, secular deindustrialization, and stalled industrialization. And in a forthcoming book next spring, we explore these issues across 9 middle-income developing countries, and we plot the countries as they move between different quadrants. None of the quadrants are fixed in terms of countries' positions, and in fact it may be desirable to move quadrants. What we find, or what we found looking at the data, particularly from the 1960s onwards, was there's a number of countries that seem to be stalled in the middle. There's some countries that are deindustrializing, and of course there's a discussion about the causes and consequences of that. And there's a number of countries who have been in the upgrading industrialization. Many of you'll recognize. I've highlighted Indonesia in red simply to show how countries move over time, or can move over time. And then moving on, I think there's an issue about whether structural transformation is different in a global value chain world compared to when production was more regional or country based prior to around 1990. Indeed, when we look at three of the most used databases on these matters, we tend to find for these are plots for employment shares for the median developing country in the sample, while it was clear that prior to the 1990s, there was a sort of upward trajectory. Now there seems to be a plateauing or stalled industrialization, certainly looking at the 10 sector database or the UNIDO INSTAT2. And actually, if we look at the median developing country in the new UNU wider economic transformation database, we see that signs of the median developing country going towards deindustrialization. So second question is there a Kuznetian tension? Kuznets wrote about a tension between economic development and inequality. And so again, we look in the book at this kind of question. What we find is you can think of, again, 4 quadrants. You can think of whether structural transformation is growth enhancing, whether it's weak or strong. And you can think of whether inequality is stable or declining or increasing. And then we sort of group countries. The bottom right-hand corner is perhaps the desirable corner to be in some ways. South Africa, I think, shows the limits to some of what we can say with this approach. But we find that, for example, inequality was fairly steady in Indonesia using the National Social Survey, while the country was going through structural transformation. And I've highlighted that Indonesia, before and after that period, has actually moved into the increasing inequality and weak growth enhancing structural transformation, just again to demonstrate that the movement of countries between quadrants. A third question I think is important is what's the relationship between employment shares or structural change and inequality? And what we find when we look at the reproduce the Baimel and Sen study, but separate modern services, financial, intermediate, real estate, from non-FIRE services, more traditional services, we tend to find that those modern services are highly unequalizing. Manufacturing is very equalizing, which I think is an important message to take away, and traditional services are somewhat unequalizing first and then more equalizing later. And I think part of this story is also about what's happened to the relationship between employment growth rates and labour productivity. Before 1990, we had this sort of upward curve where increased labour productivity growth was associated with employment growth. Now we seem to have the opposite picture of a declining line of best fits. The black line is all the samples, the dotted lines of developing countries. And then finally, what are the policy implications about this? And we're talking about the latest global evidence on structural transformation. Well, first of all, I think this really is a tertiary trilemma, is what I've called it. That's between a set of choices that may have implications for the relationship between value-added growth and employment growth. So first of all, countries can look towards the future in economic development and reindustrialize as a response to stalled industrialization or stalling in industrialization or outright deindustrialization. I think many countries are trying to do this, but they're competing. Many countries are competing over similar entry points, similar value chains, and actually the higher productivity these days compared to earlier periods makes it much harder to generate large-scale employment, I think. A second option for developing countries is to think more about the strategic promotion of high productivity services. Baldwin refers to telemigrating. This is the idea of tradable services, finance, insurance, and so forth. Very good for value-added and high-skill jobs, but not many low, medium-skill jobs, which of course is is what many developing countries are looking for. Or finally, there's a strategic promotion of high employment generation services, and these may be more traditional services, trade, education, health, and so forth. Not so strong for economic development and value added, but very good for low and medium skilled job creation. And of course, a very important link back into the human development aspects of development through public goods and higher skilled jobs. That's all from me. Thank you very much.
We thank Professor Sumner for kindly sending us this very well received presentation. Last but not least, I have the pleasure to turn to our sixth speaker at this session, Dr. Sukti Dasgupta. Dr. Dasgupta is the Chief of the Employment, Labour Markets and Youth Branch at the ILO in Geneva. She has previously worked at the ILO Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific in Bangkok and in field offices in South Asia and East Asia. She has published widely in areas of employment, poverty, and gender, and has extensive experience in working with policymakers on employment and labour market policies. Dr. Dasgupta, the ILO recently completed a comprehensive research project on structural transformation for inclusive growth and productive employment. Can you please share with us the main findings from this project, and perhaps also touch on how Asia-Pacific countries can better leverage structural policies to achieve inclusive growth and productive employment? Dr. Dasgupta, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you so much, and thanks for this invitation. And you can see my slides? Can you see
yes,
my?
Very well, thank you.
So indeed, as you said, structural transformation, or what we call really inclusive structural transformation, has been a major part of the ILO's work over the last many years, because, as has been discussed by many of the presenters before me, it is central to creating opportunities for decent work and social justice. And I will not go into the details, but even recently, the ILO, when we had a centenary year in 2019, the constituents adopted a centenary declaration where, again, structural transformation featured strongly as a means of improving the outcomes in the labor market. And that is primarily because the structural transformation in the Kaldorian sense is a reallocation of output and employment towards what we call the leading sectors. But overall, at the macro level, it leads to growth in productivity as well as more and better jobs. And I think that's absolutely critical to bear in mind. Now, obviously, structural transformation, by the way, in the previous slide, I also wanted to point out that I have a static picture of sectoral composition of employment in 2020, and you can see clearly the differences between the low income, the lower middle income to the high income countries. There is clearly a narrative over here. And obviously, therefore, structural transformation has, the gains from structural transformation are what we call inclusive, which is also taking into account inequalities, is maximum for low-income countries. But on the other hand, the research that we have done and many others have done seem to point that many low-income countries are experiencing what we call premature deindustrialization, which is affecting productivity levels and also inequalities in these countries. And on the right, if you see, the graph which shows productivity levels at the macro level as relative to those in advanced countries, in fact, the productivity levels in low-income countries have actually declined over the last few years, which is a major concern. Now, the East Asian countries, or the Asia Pacific as a region, has actually fared much better than other parts of the developing regions, as was pointed out by Professor Carlos and others. Africa, Latin America, the story is much more dismal. But even within Asia and the Pacific, there are variations across countries, parts of East and Southeast Asia, which followed the classical structural transformation model of agriculture to industry to perhaps some of services, but in some others not so. And productivity has grown in most of the Asia-Pacific countries at the macro level over the last 10 years. But perhaps what we see now is what we call a middle income trap. So, there seems to be constraints in moving forward further. Now, one of the reasons for that is, in addition to all that's happening, and in addition to, I would say, some old challenges such as informality, which still exist in most Asia-Pacific countries, even those which have been industrializing quite fast, which has major connotations about the quality of jobs and therefore inequality. There are also new challenges in the form of new technologies, as well as the move towards more environmentally sustainable methods of production. Now, in terms of new technology, of course, there's a question about whether it's labor displacing, labor augmenting. The jury is still out there, but certainly some kind of jobs will disappear, and the new kinds of jobs that will come up will perhaps require different skill sets. So there is a huge skills narrative over here. But I'll show you a graph later. What we also see is that there is a major polarization of skills, which has major impacts on inequality. For example, the middle income skills seem to be disappearing. The demand for middle skills seem to be disappearing in most of the manufacturing sectors. And also new forms of work, perhaps in the service sector, not so much in manufacturing, are coming up. But these are adding to what we call new forms of informality. And another issue that needs to be borne in mind in this conversation is the fact that even if there is no major automation in Asia-Pacific or in developing countries, automation in the advanced countries can lead to reshoring of manufacturing production, which will have implications for employment, job quality, etc. And we did a study, and there are, there is some sort of reshoring going on, but it's still not dramatic at the moment. But if robot prices go down significantly, we might see more in the future. And also in terms of environmental sustainability, it's something that we all subscribe to, but it will require a move away from production methods that are used in many developing countries, and it will have major implications for manufacturing employment and therefore, what happens in terms of labor market outcomes. Moving forward, perhaps because of these reasons, we see some changes in terms of the nature of structural transformation. Again, issues that were pointed out by colleagues who spoke before me, including Shaun's presentation on India, Professor Summers' presentation. We did a threefold decomposition by sectors, and we divided the services into traditional and modern services. And what you find is that manufacturing is still very important for productivity growth in developing countries, but services contribution to overall productivity, especially the modern services, has gone up significantly, while that of manufacturing has weakened. But on the other hand, many of these modern services, one can say, are being separated from the manufacturing sector, or their demand are derived from demand in manufacturing. And therefore, one can't really look at some modern services as separate from manufacturing. But what we also see is that, as I said earlier, that in the manufacturing sector, there is a huge polarization in terms of skills. The middle skills are declining, or the demand for middle skills are declining, and these are what you call the routine jobs, whereas those in the lower level and the higher level are increasing, and this has a direct impact on inequality in the labor market. So just in terms of recapping some of these issues, what we find is that there is, labor productivity can increase, labor productivity and employment can increase, or can be driven both by manufacturing and services, depending on which country we are looking at. Even in the Asian region, we have some variation. India, for example, is service-led, whereas China and some other East Asian countries, manufacturing-led. But manufacturing still remains critical for productivity growth, and those countries which have had more successful development pathways have relied on manufacturing. But as I said, there is significant linkages between ICT-intensive services, and therefore services can be considered as a leading complement to manufacturing rather than a lagging complement. But the fastest growth in countries, or the structural transformation in countries which have been very rapid, is also very strongly linked to rapid growth of exports. Again, a point that was already made. And as I said, the hollowing out of the middle. But there's one point I also wanted to make, which hasn't been made in this discussion so far, is that structural transformation, technological upgrading, especially in the global supply chains, is strongly linked with defeminization. So there is a very strong gender implication of structural transformation, which we don't often discuss. And finally, service-led growth, as opposed to manufacturing-led growth, is linked to more wage inequality. There shouldn't be a question mark. That's a mistake, but it is definitely linked to more wage inequality. And if we see more shift towards services because of the heterogeneity within the service sector, we are likely to see more inequality. So let me just kind of recap on the labor market trends overall in the Asia Pacific, but also globally pre-COVID, because now with COVID, we have new forms of challenges. So one is that we are at a situation where there is less employment per unit of output, largely because of technological change, but because of other factors as well. So we have a question of, we still have large youth populations, where will the jobs come from? Secondly, even if productivity is increasing, and this is primarily in the Asia Pacific region, we see that labor share is declining, which means that wages are not growing at the same rate. So labor income is falling, again, something that directly contributes to inequality. Then thirdly, we have informal employment persisting. It's again, roughly 2 billion gradually, but in Asia Pacific, very big as well. Youth employment has gone up, according to some of our recent work, again, pre-COVID. But what is interesting is that most of this employment is in temporary and informal segments, and therefore, there's a huge quality issue and therefore linking to inequality. And fourthly, the gender aspect, I think we should never forget. So now, on top of all of this, we didn't have a rosy labor market picture, and now we have COVID. And I think any discussion today cannot but talk about what is happening to the labor market in inequalities with COVID. So the ILO has come out with regular monitors, and the latest one was last month, I think. And we have estimated that in the Asia Pacific region, about 140 million full-time equivalent jobs were lost. And the biggest the biggest impact was on women and on young workers, on informal workers, SMEs, etc. But what is very interesting to note too is that the decline in jobs hasn't been translated into open unemployment. Rather, what has happened, and perhaps a bigger concern, is that the flow has been to inactivity. And most of those going into inactivity, you'll see the numbers are huge, are young women in middle-income countries and largely from Asia, Africa, Latin America. And in terms of working poverty, we don't have global data, regional data, but from countries such as in Thailand, you can clearly see that there is a growth in, there's a significant growth in working poverty. And just, I wanted to show this because most of you are based in Thailand today. There are 740,000 jobs lost in the high-risk sectors. And you will see a lot of manufacturing jobs have been lost in the context of this crisis. The key question will be, how do you bring them back? What is the recovery trajectory going to be? And obviously, in terms of recovery, the fiscal stimulus have helped. But, and you will see that, we find that 1% annual GDP growth is positively associated. Fiscal stimulus is positively associated with 0.3 percentage points increase in working hours. But in 2021, because we already see some recovery happening, even though now we have the new Omicron virus, etc., there is a huge divergence in trends between the advanced countries and the low-income countries, primarily because of the fiscal space, etc. So this is really going to be a major issue in the conversation on recovery. So where are we heading towards? And in the ILO, this has been a major conversation, partly because of the effect on the labor market. But the constituents are continuously discussing this. But just to say that inclusive structural transformation, and when I say inclusive structural transformation, to distinguish it from structural transformation per se, is macroeconomic and industrial policies along with labor market and employment policies to ensure more equality in the labor market is going to be even more critical than in the past. But it would require strategic investments both in the manufacturing and in the services sectors. And in light of the sheer scale of the job shortfalls, macroeconomic policies are going to be absolutely critical, industrial policies as well. But also, we have large youth labor forces in many Asia-Pacific countries. The question is, can the countries make the large investments in the strategic sectors? And for us, the strategic sectors are really healthcare, green, and digital going forward. And also, in the shift in terms of the environmental concerns, how can countries support the large-scale transition of businesses and workers? And can the global supply chains be transformed quickly? And you may be knowing that in September of this year, the UN Secretary General launched the Global Accelerator for Jobs and Social Protection, again, for recovery from this crisis. But the focus is very much on integrated employment and social protection strategies for structural transformation, which can promote formalization and also creation of decent jobs, because at the end of the day, social protection itself will not suffice. And before I end, I just wanted to give a snapshot of the three promising sectors that we are talking about today. One is the care sector, and we project that jobs in the care sector will increase globally, as well as in the Asia-Pacific region. But the main question there will be whether these will be decent jobs and whether they are in the lower end of the service sector, which will create more inequality as the service sector expands. And therefore, supportive employment, labor market, and gender-responsive policies will be absolutely critical. The second one is the green jobs. Again, today everyone agrees the need for green jobs, and green jobs can actually, be in the manufacturing sector, but also beyond. And here we did some from research from 2019 on investments in the renewable energy sector. So there will be jobs lost, 7 million according to our simulations, and 25 million new jobs created. But there will be a big, focus here. Has to be a big focus here on reskilling and just transition and how you mitigate the crisis. But on the other hand, in the context of this present crisis, despite all the calls for green transition and green recovery, we find that investment in green policies or green jobs or environmentally sustainable jobs has been very little. And finally, to talk about digital jobs, because this is, in a way, the digitalization helped many of us keep our jobs during the global crisis. But it has also kind of exacerbated the digital divides. Access to skills and rights, etc., is going to be very critical going forward. But one point I wanted to make is that the new kinds of jobs that are coming up, again in the services sector, because of digitalization, what we call the platform economy or the gig economy, and the ILO has recently just published a major report on the platform economy. It is a sector that is offering jobs or creating jobs for many young people in Asia Pacific, and many of the governments are looking at this platform economy as an answer to the employment challenge, especially for young people. But there are major issues around rights, around informality, social protection over here, which will need to be taken into account. So some final reflections, just to say that the constituents in the ILO have recently adopted what we call a global call to action for human-centered recovery in the context of the crisis. And today, as I speak here today, the constituents are discussing a major policy action on inequalities in the world of work, because inequalities have expanded in the context of this crisis. And structural transformation, the combination of supportive macroeconomic, fiscal, industrial policies with universal social protection and rights and gender responsive policies is a major part of this policy package. But also strengthened cooperation between the multilateral institutions, the IMF, World Bank, UN, ILO, etc. And for us, as you know, as a tripartite organization, social dialogue with workers and employers remains at the, as the basis for all these solutions going forward. So policy action will be critical, but there are huge risks that exist which can actually enhance the labor market inequalities and therefore, inequalities in the process of structural transformation. And these relate to issues that have already been raised by the other presenters, such as concerns around the global supply chain bottlenecks, the debt distress, inflation, etc., the future of work drivers, which will lead to industrial restructuring, the current geopolitical situation, which will affect trade, and of course, the risk of the great polarization, which we are looking into very carefully between the advanced and the middle income countries. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dasgupta, for sharing with us these important policy findings of ILO. It's very interesting. We were going to have a open discussion again, but I realized that we're actually running out of time, which is purely my fault. We have one question, and it's for you, Mr. Rai, and it's from Mr. Cheng Yan. So the question is, the futuristic argument of scholars like Richard Baldwin predicts that manufacturing will become increasingly jobless, while future globalization will center around the trade of services through telemigration. In his vision, the future model of structural transformation and globalization will be the Indian model, service outsourcing, and not the Chinese model, which is manufacturing outsourcing. Do you think this would be the case? And if so, why? If you can please have a short and concise answer to the question, Professor Rai. Thank you.
Thank you. Indeed, it is a very pertinent question. And Professor Baldwin has been talking about this for that, we will see increasing servicification of jobs. And to some extent, I think that has been happening. But as Dr. Dasgupta pointed out in her presentation, the productivity increases actually come from manufacturing. And so if we do indeed have the servicification of jobs, we would actually see A, inequality rising in parts of the world where that happens, and B, we would also see that there could be declines in productivity overall in those countries. So it is not very clear that it will be either way. I mean, in all countries may not follow the entire servicification route. There are stories, success stories that we are hearing out of Africa, trying to industrialize. So it is. It may happen in many countries, but not all countries, to my mind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being so concise. Final question is for Dr. Dasgupta, also from Cheng Yan. I'm allowing more time here because Cheng is part of the organization of this EGM. So if we're running over, I think we're okay. So the question is, do you envisage that COVID-19 accelerating the adoption of labor savings and labor replacing technologies in the medium long term, in addition to short-term impact? Please.
Yes, thank you. I think a very quick answer would be that COVID-19 has accelerated digitalization, and we are likely to see more labor-saving technologies. It's my understanding. But that's the reason why it is so much more important to have a combination of macro-industrial and labor market policies to ensure that this labor-saving technologies in the digital sector are complemented by other sectors such as the green care, which can grow and create jobs, but that these are decent jobs. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, the session is coming to an end. I'm sure you all enjoyed the presentations and the discussions we had today. It's been a very informative afternoon, and I'm confident that we all learned a lot. Before I close the session and hand over to my colleagues, Hamza and Sweta, please allow me to reiterate our sincere appreciation to all the prominent speakers for their excellent contributions and invaluable knowledge. Also, a big thanks to all participants for joining us in this session and for your active participation. With those words, let me give the floor to Hamza and Sweta for concluding the 3-day expert group meeting, and a big thank you to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Patrick. There's no way I can conclude things in 20-30 minutes. I have about 8-9 pages of notes from the last 3 days of 5-6 sessions. It has been an extremely learning and rewarding experience, listening in and participating in some instances in these sessions. I think the very purpose of such meetings that we organize is to learn from experts who are thinking on similar issues that we are thinking. but to draw from their experiences, from their extensive research, and try and feed them into the policy-oriented messages. We try to be as forward-looking as we can. By now, those who have been participating from day one know that the focus of our research this year for Economic and Social Survey is building forward fairer, or try and promote a recovery that actually is consistent with the inclusive development aspects of the 2030 agenda. So it's not easy. I mean, these are the kind of issues that have been debated, been discussed in the development world, academia, policy circles for decades, right? So one key issue we are really trying to be careful about is the value addition, the niche of this particular report in nudging the policymakers. Of course, one obvious entry point is, oh, the COVID-19 that has really dramatically changed a lot of things, a need for fresh thinking and so on and so forth. But there are two other things going on. One, at ESCAP, for instance, Shweta and I have been very deliberately and consistently building this research theme on thinking beyond GDP. And we have been very carefully putting out our annual publications around those themes, starting, for instance, in 2019, where we calculated SDG investments, essentially put out a call for investing in people and planet and not just economic growth. Then we followed up in 2020 with a research on sustainable consumption and production patterns. In 21, earlier this year, it was about building resilient economies and propose a model how you can actually build forward better. And this year, we're doing the third part of our narration around inclusiveness. So when we write and we say we are promoting a resilient, inclusive, and sustainable development paradigm in Asia and Pacific, we have been putting out our annual research around those themes, and it's been quite deliberate in that sense. So we wanted to look in these kind of issues, inequality dynamic issues anyways. COVID made it all the more important. And then on top of that, I think the last remark that I just heard, and this is exactly what resonates with me quite a bit. This is actually, among many other reasons, one fundamental thing that has actually changed is the reality of digitalization, the reality of working the way we are working right now. It has already, in my understanding, permanently affected the way we live and the way we work. That's not going to go back to the earlier days. The ramifications, the implications are enormous, right? You don't need office buildings. You don't need too many big roads and highways and so on and so forth, for instance, in the foreseeable future. What do? How do you're going to lose opportunities for low-skilled workers? How do you address the informal workers who don't have access to these kind of technologies, right? How do you address them? So there are some genuinely new questions that have actually emerged in the COVID context. And at the same time, this whole inertia of this conversation on inequality has been gaining momentum in global policy circles, even before the COVID pandemic. So what we have tried to tease out is revisit some of these common themes when we talked about fiscal policy and inequality dynamics on day one. Well, it's a very hot topic. A lot has been written, but we still try to figure out exactly what are the nuances, what are the nuance argument we can put forward. Yes, fiscal policy should be much more proactive, should come out, but how? Just spending more is not going to solve the issue. How you spend it, where you spend it is going to make a big difference. And then try and tie it directly with the inequality. And the story varies quite a bit from country to country. So it's not can be a one uniform set of policies. You say, thou shalt do that, and voila, you're going to have growth and inequality through fiscal policy. It's going to be a much more complicated picture. How clearly we can present that, that's a task the team has undertaken. Similarly, we're trying to nudge and push the boundaries when we talk about central banking policies and financial policies. A lot has been written and said about financial inclusion. So what is new there? Why we want to talk about that now in the COVID context, in the context of inequality? And again, we heard some genuinely new ideas. The conversation in the central banking world has been more on the green side a lot more compared to the inclusiveness part. Inclusiveness was sort of embedded in this financial inclusion kind of policies that many central banks in Asia Pacific already pursue. But it's practically, there's a divorce between typical monetary policy functions and other central banking operations like regulating banks or encouraging them to promote financial inclusion. Where is the intersection between the two? Is there a direct, deliberate role for a very core function of central bank, issuing the money in the first place that sets the scene? And nowadays talking in terms of digital currencies, for instance. How does that influence the entire debate or financial inclusion of role of central banks and monetary policy directly in terms of typical instruments influencing inequality dynamics? These are relatively very, very new themes, and there's no clear policy matches out there. So that's what we try to do. And similarly, what we heard today on structural transformation, we actually issued out a report in 2018 on structural transformation, simply mapping exactly what has been going on in Asia Pacific CSN countries, what we call country with special needs, in 2018. And we try to simply figure out patterns. The 2015 Economic and Social Survey actually was on the issue of productivity, and we saw very similar patterns there. The deindustrialization is already happening in the region. What do we do about it, right? But framing those kind of patterns and dynamics and linking them with the inequality, with the new challenges posed by COVID, with the new challenges posed by this reality of working in this digital world, the answers are not that clear cut anymore, right? Until I remember until 2015, the talk was still countries should try to go after the manufacturing route because it is more productive, because it generates more employment. The larger message used to be like this. I don't think so that you can say it that clearly now in this world, and only 6 years later, right? So it's very interesting, very exciting. This is what I mean when I say it's very rewarding to listen to so many very, very fascinating presentations. Detailed research has been done in bringing out the fundamental patterns, not only patterns, but the policy messages. So thank you very much to all the presenters. Thank you very much to my entire team who have been working tirelessly under the leadership of Shweta for months in not only organizing this particular event, but in terms of engaging with so many researchers across the globe, literally. And then now the next task is, of course, how do we bring it all together and make sure the insights that we have learned feed into the write-up of the chapters itself. So on this note, don't be surprised if my team reaches out to you a bit later, and then you might be asked to have a quick look and review of the chapters and have a look, say, okay, the point, the insights that I was sharing, I was highlighting actually made it. Or if it did not, you can point it out and we'll try and make sure it reflects overall. We can try and capture some of the messages, some of the specific studies that we heard, country case studies, for instance, as boxes, as case studies, to make sure that those things are more directly there. But again, all I'm saying is, since you have been engaged with us already, we will love to, and we will appreciate if you still have another go at it in trying to give shape to the messages and narratives. And then we will, of course, finalizing the entire publication by mid-February to be published in end March, early April. And then that becomes one of the fundamental documents for ESCAP for its commission deliberations in May and onwards for the rest of the year. We'll be engaging with think tanks, researchers, and policymakers across the globe. So thank you once again from my side. And Shweta, you want to have any further thoughts?
No, you summed it all. Thank you so much, Hamza, and thank you all for wonderful presentations. I mean, like as Hamza said, that we've been literally kind of absorbing all this knowledge for the last 3 days. It's a lot to absorb as well, and it will be reflected actually in our upcoming flagship, which is going to be launched at the end of March. So, and as Hamza said, don't be surprised if we actually come back to you and say, hey, can you actually have a look at our chapters and just give us your comments and feedback. So, look forward to interacting more with you. That's all. Thanks, Hamza.
Okay, colleagues, I think this is adios from Bangkok. Have a restful, productive, enjoyable weekend. As I was telling somebody, go out for running or cycling or something if you can. You certainly earned it, all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye for now.
Bye.